Is India from 1200 to 1900. I'm going to actually start a little bit before that. I'm going to talk a little bit about some misconceptions I've been seeing over the year so that we can clear those up as well. So if we go back before the post-classical, we have the development of belief systems in India that are foundational, that are going to have a huge influence on the political, social, and even economic structures down the line. So we're going to kind of touch on those first. So what we would talk about to start with are religions that we kind of group together as the Vedic religions. So the Vedas are these hymns that are sacred in Hinduism today. But when we talk about Vedic beliefs, what we are referring to is kind of a collective set of beliefs that Indians would have held, kind of like in the Roman Empire, how people would have just believed in the power of reason and citizenship. In India, people just believed in concepts like the rebirth of the soul. So where this came from was a mixture of beliefs from indigenous Indians and from Indo-Europeans who migrated into India, and we call those Indo-Europeans Aryans generally. So the Aryans didn't invade. They moved into India, and then they began conquering people around them. They were a warlike people, and so the Vedic religions come from that. So before we have a formalized religion in parts of India, we talk about these Vedic religions. So the components of them would be reincarnation, which I mentioned already, rebirth of the soul, and in connection to that, a belief that your behavior in this world is going to influence your reincarnation. So that if you follow your duty and you act in a moral way, you would be reincarnated better or potentially worse. And so that is the justification for the caste system. So the caste system seems to have come originally from the Aryan conquest of various states in India, various regions in India. And so they, as conquerors tend to do, put themselves at the top of the social class system, put the conquered people at the bottom. The caste system is going to be tremendously important in India because it regulates things that in other regions of the world the state would have to regulate. So things like marriage and your job and interactions with other people in China, those were all more or less regulated by the government. So India doesn't need to have a government regulate them because people have them kind of embedded into the caste system. So that means that when there is some kind of imperial downturn, if an empire collapses, then it's not as big a deal in India as it is in other regions. So what will happen by the time we get to about 500 is these Vedic religions will coalesce into kind of a formalized version of the religion, which we call Hinduism. And that Hinduism develops over a stretch of time. And there are historians that would even say that Hinduism doesn't become Hinduism until the end of the classical period. So in the Vedic religions, there's a good deal of focus on priestly power and the role of caste in determining things like your job and who you can interact with. And so then there's, as a result, a good deal of inequality in the religion. And kind of on the flip side of that, early on in Hinduism, or in the Vedic religions, there wasn't really much of an effort made to explain the religion. The religion was practical. You did these things because it helped your crops to grow, and it helped you to have male children, and the things that people generally wanted to have happen. So they weren't following it in order to know the greater meaning of life. Well, as civilization develops and greater agricultural surpluses are being generated, there are groups of people that are living farther away from death. They don't have to worry as much about dying. And so they tend to worry then more about these big questions, like why are we here? What's the point of it all? And so Buddhism then forms in opposition to those earlier Vedic religions, in opposition to the caste system, in opposition to priestly power. But in connection to ideas like reincarnation and karma. So the Buddhism is, according to the Buddhist traditions, founded by a Hindu, Siddhartha, who's trying to discover the cause of suffering. And so he concludes that life is suffering, and that the cause of that suffering is chasing after things that don't matter. And he characterizes this as desire. And so this is not desire for survival, it's desire for things that you have convinced yourself that you need. And so the Buddhists kind of focus on this concept of the self, that because you have this identity, you've talked yourself into wanting a certain job and wanting certain possessions and wanting more sleep, for instance, and that all causes suffering. So if you could just let go of all that, if you could basically extinguish yourself, then you would stop suffering. So this is a very egalitarian religion, because the Buddhists are saying that no matter what your caste or no matter what your class, you can achieve this state where you end your suffering. That state is nirvana, and you escape the cycle of rebirth. So why don't more people convert from Hinduism? If there's this inequality between the castes, if there's this rigid hierarchy that you can't, in theory, move up or down in while you're still alive? Well, there are a couple of reasons. One is that India is a very diverse place. It's diverse geographically. There are mountains in the north, and there are plateaus in the central part. There are areas that are more tropical, more desert. And along with that, it's linguistically diverse, and that tends to lead to other forms of cultural diversity. So Hinduism as a belief system is very, very flexible. So people in different regions could have different points of emphasis when it comes to practicing Hinduism. They might focus more on the polytheistic components of the religion. They might focus more on Brahman, the universal spirit, and contend that all of the gods and goddesses are just manifestations of that. There are different rituals that can be employed in Hinduism in different areas. There are even different accounts of the creation of humans in the world in Hinduism that one could believe in depending on which part of India they were living. So Hinduism then appealed to Indians who were diverse themselves because of its diversity. And the other part of it is the caste system is going to include things like your job. So if you just choose to convert to a new religion, then it's likely to be the case that you would lose that job, and you would lose your connection to your family, you would lose your connection to the village, you would become an outcast. And so then for many people, there's not much to gain in converting to Buddhism unless there is a mass conversion. And so for a while, there is state support for Buddhism under the Emperor Ashoka of the Mauryan Empire. But that soon fades away. And so Hinduism is able to withstand this challenge of Buddhism. The other thing we want to look at here is the significance of India in this time period. So there is often this misconception among students that there wasn't much Indian Ocean trade until Muslim empires were formed, because in the course we focus so much on Arab domination of Indian Ocean trade and Arab dhows and lateen sails. But the Indians were participants in that trading system going back to at least the classical period. And so it's in the classical period that we first see things like lateen sails and dhows. And so it's not altogether clear who developed those types of ships and sailing mechanisms, right? So the Indians would have been able to trade using monsoon winds before 600 CE. And so as a result, they have a tremendous cultural influence on places around them. So if you look at the map that shows the spread of Buddhism, the arrows indicate the spread of Buddhism, but those arrows were following pretty closely along with established trading routes. And so the Indians are trading over land, they're trading over sea, and it's in this time period that we would see India as probably the most culturally influential of the societies. So that as you follow those arrows into Southeast Asia, there were societies that became Hindu as a result, and societies that became Buddhist as a result. Eventually there will be empires that arise that are going to use Buddhism as a source of legitimacy. I mentioned the comeback that Hinduism makes. So in the late classical period, there's an empire, the Gupta Empire, that does use Hinduism as a source of legitimacy. And when it collapses, it is followed by states that are called Rajput states that are also Hindu states that use Hinduism as its the primary source of legitimacy. And so the document here is from a book called Southernization that has basically argued that Indians have the same influence in the classical period, early post-classical period, as Western Europeans do in the modern to early contemporary period. So here she focuses on the number system and the concept of zero, that the Indian number system spreads to Arab regions, then spreads to Europe. We call it the Arabic numeral system, but it originates in India. And so Southernization is the counterpart then of Westernization. All right, so moving on to the early part of the post-classical period, before the course starts, because we want to, again, kind of say by 1200, this was true in India. So we already have established that by 1200, Hinduism exists in India and Buddhism exists in India. And by 1200, there were Indian states that were using Hinduism more than Buddhism as a source of legitimacy. All right, so what happens at this point is Islam is introduced. And Islam is developed in the 7th century, so in the 600s, and spreads first along trade routes to India. So you can see those trade routes there. Muslims begin to move into the western part of India and establish diasporic communities of merchants. And so the attraction of Islam in that time period was, first and foremost, that it made it easier to trade, because Islam includes within it a set of rules, Sharia law, that are the same for all Muslims, regardless of whether they live in the empire, the caliphate, or in some other Islamic community. And so it's simply easier to trade for an Indian merchant if they are a Muslim. The other thing that we look at here are the ways that Hinduism and Islam are opposite religions. Islam was far more egalitarian. It was more egalitarian in its treatment of women. It did not have a caste system. Anybody could approach God, and submit to God, and therefore be saved, versus the Hindu caste system, which was rigid and said that the only people who could achieve the state of perfection, moksha, were people in the highest caste, the priestly caste, and according to many Hindus, only Brahmin men could achieve that state of perfection. And so again, there would seem to be this draw of a more egalitarian religion. On the flip side, Islam is monotheistic. You have to believe in monotheism. And so it tends to focus on one set of beliefs, so we call that orthodoxy, and it tends to focus on one set of practices, so the 5 pillars of Islam that you must follow. We call that orthopraxy, versus Hinduism, which has a variety of beliefs and a variety of practices that you can follow depending on which part of India you live in. And so that, then we can see this as kind of a tension between opposites. Now, because Islam is spreading through trade, it is going to be transformed. So when we see religions move, they are always going to change. They're always going to be transformed. So we have 2 things going on. One is the movement of the religion, that's diffusion, and the other is the development of syncretic beliefs, of beliefs that fuse different elements of culture. That's the transformation. So when people convert due to trade, they are converting voluntarily. They're not being forced to do so. So they have to be persuaded. And the basic calculation that goes on, and nobody kind of thinks in these kinds of cynical ways. They're not creating a pro and con chart, but when somebody converts due to trade, then there are certain elements of their culture they're willing to get rid of, and certain elements of their culture they're not willing to get rid of, they want to keep. And so the transformation reflects that. So when Islam begins to spread to India, what we would see is that Muslims continued to recognize the caste system and even used the caste system in spite of the religious beliefs. That was true. And Indian practices with regard to women went out over the Muslim rules that should have, to some degree or another, elevated women. And so that's the transformation that occurs. All right, now the big showdown between the religions, though, is going to come due to the conquest of northern India and the creation of a Muslim empire, the Delhi Sultanate. So you can see the map to the right, the red area across the north. It's very typical that Indian empires are going to form empires across that Indus-Ganges plain. It's the fertile area. It's easier to conquer as a wide open plain than the areas to the south. None of the empires until the 19th century that govern India are going to control the entire subcontinent. And so the Delhi Sultanate then is going to establish an empire. So they're breaking an Indian tradition then. Traditionally, India is divided up into smaller states. We call that regionalism. And sometimes students mistake regionalism for being anarchy. It's not anarchy. It's not that there's lawlessness. It's that there's no large empire. And so when the Mauryan Empire collapses, there are centuries of regionalism. When the Gupta Empire collapses, there are centuries of regionalism. And that fits with the cultural diversity of India, but it also makes it easier for outside groups to come in and conquer. All right, so here we're going to see a good deal of converts, especially from low-caste Hindus and from former Buddhists, because there's no longer state support for Buddhism, and particularly in the areas dominated by the Delhi Sultanate. So here there is a much greater pressure put on Hindus to convert. So in the old system, you're converting because it made it easier to trade. But here, what we would find is that Hindus were forced to pay the head tax, the jizya on the people of the book. They were treated as second-class citizens. They couldn't hold political office. And so you do get a lot of conversion as a result of that. Now, the Muslims that are going to be most successful in seeking converts are Sufis. Sufis are Muslim mystics. They believe that there is a way for your soul to directly connect to God. And so there are all kinds of Sufis. There are more orthodox Sufis. So if you were to find Sufis in Baghdad, they would practice Islam in a similar way to any of the other members of the ulama in Baghdad. Whereas Sufis, as you get farther away from Baghdad, from the heart of the caliphate, are going to be more accommodating and are going to be more willing to accept practices from other religions. And so what the Sufis would say to potential converts is, you can keep this Hindu ritual that you love so much as long as you are now dedicating it to the worship of the one God. So as long as you embrace monotheism, you can keep other elements of your religion that you like. This happens with every religion. It is why in Western Europe we have the incorporation of earlier non-Christian holidays like Christmas, a midwinter celebration, or Easter, which includes a lot of fertility rites symbols. Now, there's also going to be a response by Hindus. Hinduism, remember, was supported by a number of states. And this is a critical thing to understand. When there are states that use a religion as a state religion, an official religion, then it is harder to gain converts in those areas. And so the Delhi Sultanate did not replace all of the Rajput states. You can see it conquered the area where the Rajputs would have been. But it was often easier for them to reduce those Rajput kingdoms to tributary states than to replace the government altogether. And so there remains fairly strong state support for Hinduism. There is also the support to Hinduism given by the caste system. And with its reciprocal relationships, if you break away from the caste system, then you might lose access to the land you were farming before. But in addition to that, there is definitely a response by Hindus to incorporate elements of Islam that people were finding attractive. And so the two things that would have attracted people to Islam would have been the fact that all Muslims were seen as equal before God. So it doesn't matter what class you are, you can achieve salvation in a single lifetime. That would have been attractive. And then the one lifetime part of it. You don't need to go through the cycle of rebirth over and over and over again to purify your soul and achieve a state of perfection. You can do it through the intervention of God in one life. And so the Bhakti movements, they incorporate those into Hinduism. And so again, this would not have been done cynically. It's not like some Hindu was out there thinking, I'm going to steal these ideas from Islam. Instead, what they would say is, these beliefs have always been part of Hinduism. Let's just clarify how you can do this in Hinduism. So a Bhakti movement involved this. A Hindu could dedicate himself or herself to one single god, so Shiva. And by performing rituals to that one single god, devoting oneself to that god, then that god would intervene on your behalf and you could achieve this state of perfection, moksha, and escape the cycle of rebirth in one lifetime. No matter what caste you were, no matter how perfectly in other ways or imperfectly you were living your life. So this is just one example, though, of how when a religion that has strong state support is challenged, it tends to push back and reassert itself and try to remind people of why it's awesome to be part of their religion. We would see the same thing in the Catholic Church when it is challenged by the Protestants in Europe in the 1500s. And we would see the same thing in China when Confucians felt like Buddhism and Taoism were challenging them, and the development of Neo-Confucianism was the result there. So Bhakti movements would reflect a similar dynamic. So the outcome is that most of the people in the subcontinent remain Hindu in spite of all of these pressures. And so you end up with Muslims concentrated in the areas that the Delhi Sultanate has direct political rule over, but otherwise the subcontinent is primarily Hindu. The other thing we see is in the map to the left, the conquest of Tamerlane. So Timur the Lame, he was one of these really brutal conquerors leading pastoral groups. So the Turks were at best recently civilized, at worst pastoral groups that were not civilized, didn't have cities. And so he was one of the brutal conquerors because he would do things like skin alive the people who resisted and decapitate people and stack their heads in pyramids. And so you can see his conquest there. So he's going to weaken the control of the Delhi Sultanate. So in a way, what we're seeing towards the end of the post-classical era is kind of a reversion back to regionalism in India. So with these political ups and downs, remember that the caste system is going to stay in place, and it will maintain the existing or the economic system. And so while the politics are kind of rising and falling, India's economy remains vibrant, and so it's not having as much of an impact there. So here is a depiction of Timur's defeat of Delhi. So he comes in, lays siege to Delhi, and you can see the nomadic horsemen there at the beginning firing their bows. This is really the last time that kind of thing is going to happen. And what will occur after this is the development of gunpowder arms. So first we'll have gunpowder cannon, and then we'll get to gunpowder firearms. And the next empire that conquers northern India is going to have these kinds of gunpowder weapons. And so that kind of thing, the development of gunpowder weapons requires cities and manufacturing. And so from this point on, nomads and pastoral groups, they're not going to form these large empires as they had earlier on. So that brings us to that gunpowder empire, the Mughal Empire. And so once again, you can see the Mughal Empire conquering the Indus-Ganges plain on the map over to the right. And so you have Babur as the founder of the empire, but the most famous of the rulers is Akbar. And so Akbar is a Mughal, which means he's going to claim that he's a descendant of Genghis Khan, of the Mongols. He is Muslim. He is from what we would call Afghanistan, what was part of the Persian Empire, and so that means that religiously, linguistically, ethnically, he is not Indian, and he finds himself ruling over all of these Indian people, many of whom are Hindu, and so his way of governing is to treat Hindus as if they're Muslims. They don't pay the head tax. They aren't dhimmi. They could occupy high levels in the bureaucracy, although mostly Muslims occupied those positions, and they could occupy high military positions. And to kind of seal the deal, Akbar marries a Hindu princess. And so that is kind of the foundation of Mughal success. What we would see in Mughal India and in other areas that were tolerant is that when you're tolerant of all these different groups, it is conducive to economic growth. Lots of people can move to that area and they can feel safe in owning property and producing. And so there is this great economic boom that occurs under the Mughals. The word Mughal, for somebody who's super rich, comes from the Mughal Empire. The Mughal sale of silk textiles in the south, but more famously the cotton textiles across the Indus-Ganges plain, is going to attract a lot of European silver. So in 1492, Columbus sails the ocean blue. That's kind of the benchmark date for figuring out the rest of the European voyages. Almost at the same time, Vasco da Gama sails around Africa, reaches India. That's 1495. And so you have this direct connection where the Europeans did not have the high-level manufactured goods that the Mughals did. But what the Europeans increasingly had was silver from the New World. And while the Indians didn't really value silver themselves, they saw how other people valued silver, and the Chinese valued silver. So they begin to absorb this silver from the Europeans, which then makes its way off to places like China. So when that kind of wealth is generated, it does tend to lead to innovations in the arts. And so we see the Taj Mahal in the top center, which was shows the Persian influences, it shows the influences from other parts of the Muslim world, and it shows Hindu influences all blended into one. It is a tomb, of course. Shah Jahan built it for his favorite wife, but it is intended more as a symbol of his power and his wealth. So that kind of wealth is going to attract a lot of European joint stock companies. These are transnational companies that operate around the world. And so you had the British East India Company taking a leading role here. So that area, if you look at the map on to the right, around Bengal, is the area the East India Company first makes inroads in. And so the East India Company is going to take advantage of the regionalism of India, and in particular of the fragmentation of the Mughal Empire. So after Akbar, you have a series of capable rulers, and then you have a ruler, Aurangzeb, who is not tolerant, who persecutes Sikhs, who persecutes some of the Hindu Rajputs, and Aurangzeb is able to make that work basically through his military prowess. But he kind of sets the foundation for the disintegration of the Mughal Empire, because his successors are not going to be able to control all these divided groups. So Aurangzeb is able to compel Hindus and Sikhs into following his rule, even if he's not tolerant, but other Mughal emperors could not. And so what is also going on here is that the Mughal system was not highly centralized compared to what we would see in places like Britain at this time. And so the British are coming up with superior ways to tax. And so as a result of that greater tax revenue, it's easier for the British and the East India Company in this situation to pay soldiers, and harder for the Mughals to do that. And so that is going to lead to conflict between the two. So this is a great document for describing the interaction. So what eventually happens is this. You have Siraj-ud-Daulah, who lays siege to Fort William in Calcutta, and he wins, and so he captures the British there, and he throws them into a room that becomes known as the Black Hole of Calcutta. And depending on whose account you're reading, maybe a couple of dozen of the British thrown in there die, they suffocate, or it might be over 100 that die in there, which is probably an exaggeration. But this is an account by a British captain under the East India Company, and he's explaining how now the cargoes expected from England will remain unsold. The ships will not sail, and then we can expect that this will happen again and again and again. And he's saying not only is this going to hurt the British, but it will also be felt in India. And he says the different parts of India will also severely feel the loss of Calcutta. And so again, it's, as a British citizen, he may be exaggerating some of this, but as it turns out, he was right. And so he's actually more valuable to us as a first-hand witness, because he was there. He knows exactly how this is going to impact India, and so therefore he's credible in describing that this is going to undermine the Indian economy, and it did. So this is kind of leading us into the next period of time. The British East India Company is going to reclaim its territory, and so in the 7 Years' War, the British East India Company is going to defeat the Mughals, and then it's going to expand its territory. And much of this was justified by what's known as the civilizing mission. And the British at this point have come to believe that their technological superiority is a sign that their culture is superior to that of India's. And so therefore they have a mission to civilize places like India. And that meant doing things like outlawing sati. So sati is when a widow burns herself on the husband's funeral pyre, or is forced to burn herself on the husband's funeral pyre. So the British see this as a sign of barbarity, and they begin to argue that in a civilized world you should not have this. And there were Indians that believed the same thing and that participated in this move to outlaw sati. But it is a great illustration of kind of this sense of cultural superiority that the British felt. And so as a consequence, this company is going to come to control large parts of India. And it is kind of an early illustration of what happens when a for-profit multinational corporation controls areas far away. So the whole point of the East India Company being there is to generate as much money as possible. And they can do that by driving down the cost of operating there and driving up the revenue that they're getting. And so that precipitates a famine. And so the famine is made much worse by the policies of the East India Company. There actually is a parliamentary trial eventually over the East India Company's role in precipitating that famine. But it's similar in a lot of ways to the exploitation of people we would see today in countries like Vietnam or in Burma or in Bangladesh, where you would have people working in sweatshops for these multinational corporations. So the East India Company's policies, kind of collectively, not the famine specifically, but their collective policies will lead to an uprising of Indian soldiers. Indian soldiers who were trained to fight in the European style are called sepoys. So in the midpoint of the 19th century, there is a massive uprising by the sepoys. So what precipitates it is this rumor that the East India Company is greasing the rifle cartridges with either pork fat or cow fat. So that would antagonize Hindus and Muslims. So the sepoys are concerned about this because the cartridges had to be torn open with your teeth. You would hold the rifle in one hand, you would tear open the cartridge with your teeth, holding it in the other hand, then you would pour the gunpowder down the rifle barrel. And so they approach the East India Company about this, and the East India Company blows them off. And so this unleashes a massive anti-colonial uprising. It's not just the sepoys, it's Indians generally that take this opportunity to try to drive the British out. And it is close. The British almost lose their most valuable colony. And that is what prompts the British to take direct control. That's where the British Raj comes from. Victoria, the Queen of England, becomes the Empress of India. And so the British government takes direct control. So the direct British rule works in this way. So you have this diversity throughout India, and the British were well aware of this. What they would do is they would use what was known as the divide and rule tactic. And so a great illustration of this is the British bureaucracy. So the British, to rule all of India, created a massive colonial bureaucracy, which is kind of a good news, bad news proposition. And let's start with the good news. Good news. If you were an educated Indian, you could seek employment in the British bureaucracy. And that meant you could have a role in governing India. And this is going to mean in the 20th century that when India gains independence, there are lots of trained public administrators. Other colonies are not going to be so lucky. So let's get to the bad news then. The bad news is that the British dominate this system, and they dominate it in a couple of ways. So one, the top level of the bureaucracy, those jobs can only be held by people who are British. So no matter how good you are as an administrator, if you're an Indian, you can't rise beyond a certain level, no matter how educated you are. And the other thing is that the British are employing kind of a divide and rule approach with the bureaucracy. They're recruiting Indians from one part of India and sending them to govern people who speak different languages and have different customs, because the feeling is that they can't make common cause if that's the case, right? They're not going to team up against the British. And so for a while, direct British rule is going to work, because if you were a low-caste Hindu, what does it matter to you if the British are calling the shots or somebody from Afghanistan, some Persian under the Mughal Empire? It didn't. Right? And so what happens though over time is that the British rule becomes more exploitative and more clearly racist than earlier imperial exploitation. And so the outcome of that is going to be the rise of nationalism. So nationalism is a common cultural bond, and so if we go to England, for instance, speaking English and being Christian and believing in English political ideals, that had defined nationalism around, if we say 1700, 1600. And so in India, though, where there's this cultural diversity, it's not quite as easy. What defines nationalism? Are you defined by the language you speak? Are you defined by the religion you practiced? There hadn't been an India until the British unite the entire subcontinent. And so this is going to be a puzzle. It's going to take a while to figure out. There are going to be Hindu nationalist groups, the Muslim League, and Hindu Muslim national groups, the Muslim League, and Hindu national groups, the Indian National Congress. And so at first, nationalism is defined oppositionally. The low caste and middle class Hindus are going to come together because they despise British rule. And so as time goes on, this nationalist movement is going to gain strength, but it's not until the period in between World War I and World War II that the nationalist movement will be successful. So that wraps up our talk of India. The next region we'll talk about is the Middle East.